Hello, everyone. My name is Micah Pellerin, and I'm going to be giving a presentation on the murder of Gaspar Milazzo and Sam Perino. So, this case occurred on May 1st, 1930, in Detroit, Michigan, at the Verner Highway Fish Market. Our victims are Sam Perino, an associate of Gaspar Milazzo, and Gaspar Milazzo himself, who was a pretty high ranking mafia boss in Detroit. The two were lured to the fish market under the guise of discussing a peace treaty to end an ongoing dispute between some of the local sects of the Detroit Mafia. But instead, they were ambushed and subsequently murdered. To give a breakdown of the attack, Gaspar Milazzo and Sam Perino went and sat down in a back room of the fish market. Sorry, not a back room. Sat down in a room at the fish market to eat lunch, waiting for some other high-ranking mob officials to come out and discuss the peace treaty with them. But instead, two gunmen emerged from a back room and opened fire. And now both of these gunmen used shotguns because back then, particularly with mob hits, they typically use shotguns. Usually a double-barrel sawn-off shotgun because they're very lethal, and they got the job done quick. After the murder, the shooters fled through a rear exit, and the aftermath of this would lead to the Castellamarese War, which kind of brought back the American Mafia into full swing after kind of like a brief hiatus. And this was at the height of prohibition, so tensions were extremely high. Here are my sources. Okay. Crime scene recreations. So there wasn't a lot of information online about this. I found a couple autopsy reports and of course the news article about it from the Detroit Free Press. Um so if you take a look right here, we have Gaspar Milazzo and Sam Perino at the table that they were sitting at while they were shot. And then we have the shotgun shell casings that were found by the door that the gunman entered through. Um, I made this creation this reconstruction with just things I had on hand because I didn't have a lot of money at the time. You see the cassette cases here representing the four walls of the room, and then of course you have the door. That's the table, two bodies, shell casings. And then we have the drawing down here. Got Gaspar Milazzo and Sam Perino. Again, the shell casings. Um, And there was a door to a storage room in the room that they were in. That's not in my reconstruction, but it is in the sketch. And of course, it's where the gunman entered through. And then we also have the legend saying what is what in the scene. At the time of this crime, forensics was still in its infancy, so they weren't able to do a lot, and nothing that they found ever led to any convictions or finding any suspects. And part of that has to do with the fact that none of the witnesses said anything, whether that was out of fear of the mob or because they were bribed, who knows. Um, but the police collected the bodies and the spent shotgun shells found. And the shells were analyzed using just basic visual comparison and rudimentary matching to kind of like see if they were from the same shotgun or not. But again, ballistics, everything about forensics really was in its infancy, so they didn't really have a good way of tracing it back to the original firearm. As for the processing, they just did the standard things at the time: chalk outlines, witness interviews, which again, like I said, led to nothing substantial, and of course, your standard photography. For the autopsy, it was just visual inspection of the wounds just to determine cause of death. So the coroner looked at the bodies, determined that, yep, they were killed by shotguns, and that was it, really. But again, we didn't have DNA profiling We weren't able to get fingerprints from complex surfaces. Crime scene preservation wasn't really a priority, and once again, the witnesses didn't provide anything useful. If the crime were to happen today, they would have been able to get the fingerprints from more complex surfaces. They would have looked for gunshot residue and maybe even try to trace it back to some of the witnesses at the scene to see if any of them were complicit. And of course, they'd look for trace DNA on anything that they could find. And then they'd use DNA profiling to determine who that DNA belonged to. Another thing that they would have done today, which is really interesting to me, is 3D laser scanning, or FARO, which is basically where they use a laser scanner and take a look at any possible uh, bullet holes or anything that could like indicate, hey, a bullet flew by here, passed through here, and then they use that scanning to recreate the path that the bullet took. And as for the bodies, they just do CT scans to figure out the trajectory of the bullets going through the bodies. But that wouldn't really help much to determine who did the murders. It would just be useful being in getting a more in-depth cause of death, I guess one could say. My takeaways from this case are that forensic science has evolved so much since the 1930s. And that was a really long time ago. 1930s was almost 100 years ago at this point. Um the main reason why the suspects weren't found, besides the witnesses not giving any good information, is the fact that we didn't have DNA profiling, didn't have proper ballistics analysis. The crime scene really wasn't preserved all that well, things like that. And another thing, going back to preservation and whatnot, trying to actually draw the sketch and make the reconstruction of the crime scene showed me just how poor basic documentation was in the 1930s. I wasn't able to find any archives of photos, nothing like that. It was pretty tough. And my final takeaway is that forensic science has evolved to the point that investigators can go to a crime scene, and more often than not, they end up finding very real, very concrete evidence that leads to a conviction, rather than having to rely on some very, very basic, primitive techniques that they had in the past. And that is all.